Thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Small businesses in Canada can claim up to $5,000 from a class action settlement with Visa, Mastercard, and banks. Here to discuss this and how businesses contend with credit card payments is Corinne Pohlmann. She is a Senior Vice President, National Affairs and Partnerships at the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Welcome to the program, Corinne.
Thanks for having me.
First, could you give us a little bit more detail about this class action settlement?
Sure. So the class action settlement was actually launched back in 2011, and it was really claiming, it was actually filed against Visa, MasterCard, and the major banks in Canada who issue credit cards, claiming that they were sort of being somewhat anti-competitive in that they wouldn't allow small businesses or merchants of any kind to surcharge or to forcing them to accept any card that they had to take, but also having exorbitant fees that were basically too high for many merchants to deal with. However, through the course of this particular class action settlement, many of these folks that the class action was launched against settled throughout the period of 10 years. And finally, the last group settled last October. And as a result of that, we have sort of two things that have occurred. One is an amount of about $130 million that was then to be redistributed to merchants. That is the settlement process, which is actually open right now. And there's a second component, which means Visa and MasterCard are going to allow merchants to surcharge in the future for any client, if they so choose, who pays by credit card.
So go through the surcharge part of it again. What does that entail?
So a surcharge is essentially an amount of money a merchant can charge their customers to cover their costs of accepting credit cards. So that is something that we've been not allowed to do for many years now or ever. And as of October 6th, they should be allowed to now surcharge if they so choose. There is a bit of a process to go through. If you choose to surcharge your customers, you have to register with the credit card networks and with your acquirer and do a few things that the companies require of you, Visa, MasterCard, that is, and then you'll be able to recoup some of those costs that are basically that you have to absorb as a merchant.
So you said $130 million, is that right, Corinne?
Yeah. Correct. That is the settlement amount.
Yeah, that's a lot of money, obviously. So I do want to get into the wider issue of these processing fees. We will do that. But first, maybe what are the timelines? How do companies, businesses apply for this? Some of those details probably would be important to share.
Yes, because we're coming up to the deadline. If you want to get a piece of the class action settlement, you're going to have to apply through a website called creditcardclassaction.ca, and there you can submit some information about your company. Basically, if you are a merchant and you've accepted either Visa and MasterCard and paid merchant fees to Visa or MasterCard anytime between 2001 and 2021, and there are some specific dates in either year, then you could be eligible for some of that money. It also depends on the volume of your company. So if you have revenues of less than $5 million on average per year, you can claim up to $30 per year for every year that you actually accepted credit cards. And then if you're a bit larger, between 5 and 250 million, then you can actually apply for 5 million and 20 million. Then you can apply for $250 per year. And it's a fairly simple process for those folks. So it's just a matter of filling out a few forms and attesting that you actually accepted credit cards. And then for the most part, you should be able to get at least some of that money.
And the deadline is again what?
September 30th. So we're coming up to that very soon. So yes. Get your application in by September 30th to sort of get a little bit of a piece of that settlement.
Fantastic. And was the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, were they part of this settlement? How were you involved?
So we were not a part of the lawsuit. However, we've been watching it closely for the last decade because it does have obviously big implications for small businesses. One of the things that we do as an organization is push for lower credit card fees and for more a level playing field within that particular sector. And this particular settlement or class action lawsuit was trying to achieve just that. So it's been a very interesting one for us to watch. We have since been working with the lawyers representing obviously the claimant in this case to make sure that small businesses are aware aware that this class action settlement is going on and that there is an opportunity to make back a little bit of money to cover some of the costs that they have paid to credit card companies over the last decade.
We're going to continue our conversation with Corinne Pohlmann after the break. Please stay with us. Corinne, I'd like to broaden it out a little bit. We talked a little bit about this settlement and the fees being returned to small businesses. How is this part of the wider issue, however, of credit card processing fees? I'm not sure a lot of people realize just how small businesses are affected by this.
Yes. So obviously, I think a lot of consumers don't always realize that when you pay with a credit card, the merchant actually pays a fee to accept that credit card. And it can range anywhere from like 0.5, 1% of the transaction, all the way up to 4 and even higher percent of that transaction. So it can be quite significant. And what's really bizarre about the industry is that the smaller the business, usually the higher the fee they have to pay, because one, they don't have the ability to negotiate as easily with as larger companies, and volume matters. So smaller businesses tend to pay some of the highest fees to credit card companies. And just to give people a sense of how much that costs merchants in Canada, we estimate that credit card merchant fees alone are about probably in the vicinity of $5 billion per year
Wow.
for credit card companies. So it's a significant amount of money that's earned on that. And the other thing that's important to realize is that different credit cards have different fees for merchants. So a credit card that we call a premium credit card, so ones that often have air travel points or cash back, they actually cost the merchant more to accept, even though they don't get any benefit from it. The customer does, but the merchant still has to pay more to accept those cards. So it can be very challenging for merchants to figure out exactly what their costs are going to be from month to month, because they don't know what the mix of credit cards are going to be that they're accepting on any given day.
Yeah, and has this been just evolved over time into this system? It seems a bit bizarre when you think about it.
It's a super complicated industry because there's multiple players involved. There's Visa and Mastercard, of course. There is the acquirer, which is the company that actually processes the payments on behalf of the merchant. And then there's the banks who issue the credit cards. All of them get a piece of the pie when it comes to those fees themselves. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of people think that the money is made off the consumers and the interest that they may have to pay if they don't pay off their full amount every month. But certainly that's a component. But a big component too is what the merchants pay to accept credit cards at their place of business.
Now, are you calling on the federal government to do anything with regard to these issues?
Yes, certainly. I mean, credit card fees continue to be quite high. Over the course of the last 6, 7 years, we've seen the government get involved in sort of working with the industry to lower fees on average. We've seen that happen twice, once in 2015 and again in 2020. But small businesses are still paying on average about 1.4% on every transaction. And this is only for sort of those in-store type of transactions. Through COVID, of course, we've seen a huge increase in a move towards digital payments. So people are moving away from cash more towards using credit cards, and they're paying online a lot more. Those types of transactions cost even more to a small business. Yes. So because they're considered riskier types of transactions. So while credit card fees themselves have technically not gone up much in the last 5 years, because the volume and the mix of how people pay has changed more towards credit cards and other digital means, the overall costs for small businesses have been going up.
And just to refer to something you said earlier, you're talking about a $5 billion a year industry. Is that what the banks are making off this?
Yeah, well, it's obviously shared among banks, credit card companies, and acquirers, though banks make the biggest proportion of that. So it is quite significant. But we've been certainly pushing government to continue to push for finding ways to lower those fees. And of course, you can imagine there's quite a bit of pushback from some of those players because they make quite a bit of money off of those merchant fees, often using as a reason why they can provide points. And Canadians love their points,
They do.
but as a reason why they need to have these fees in place in order to continue to provide that kind of option to consumers when it comes to credit cards.
We've got less than a minute left before the break, but just on the points, what if it was an Aeroplan card, let's say, isn't it Aeroplan that's giving the points? I don't understand why it's more costly for the credit card companies.
Well, there's no doubt that, I mean, I'm not an expert on how
Yeah,
the
yeah.
points are all, but my understanding is the banks would obviously pay Aeroplan to be able to provide those points
Oh,
to
okay,
their
okay,
customers, right?
sure.
So they need to sort of cover their costs and making everybody's going to get something out of this.
Yeah, that's
None of it
right.
is done out of the bottom of their hearts or anything. So, so certainly that would be a part of what it is that they're offering, because obviously those points become like money basically to purchase a flight or some other products through
Indeed.
either Air Miles or Aeroplan. So,
Indeed. Well, we're going to take a brief break. We'll be back with this very interesting topic after the break. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Corinne Pohlmann. She's of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, talking about these processing fees for credit cards. Again, just I'm kind of fixated on this. I just, trying to make sure I understand the economics of it. So is Canada an outlier versus other countries when it comes to these credit card fees? Are they higher or lower in other countries?
so generally speaking, we are among the highest in the world. However, the Americans pay even more.
Oh,
So
okay.
merchants in the United States do pay more than they do in Canada on average, because we've had a little bit of government intervention in terms of trying to push the industry to lower those rates. But there are jurisdictions such as Australia and the European Union where there's been legislation implemented to actually force credit card companies to not charge more than a certain amount on merchant fees, and they're much lower rates as a result in those countries. That is something we've certainly looked at in Canada to see if that's something. But what we've discovered in places like Australia is when those regulations come into place, the banks are going to find other ways to
Right.
recoup those losses. So we see massive increases in bank account fees or something along those lines. So we want to try to do in Canada in a way that it doesn't overall increase costs for small business.
Indeed, indeed. So I've got an open-ended question for you now. Do you think that banks have too much power over small businesses in this country?
Well, I mean, I think Canada's always suffered a little bit from not having a huge amount of competition in the banking sector. We are basically dominated by five big banks in the country, and that does limit the ability of businesses to really shop between banks. Again, in comparison to the United States, there's a lot more ability to compete and get a better offers when it comes to things like loans and bank accounts. I think in Canada, it's a bit more difficult in that regard. So they certainly have quite a bit of a stronghold, I would say, in Canada, and it is a bit challenging for other entrants into that space. But we certainly are excited about things like open banking coming in the future that hopefully can start broadening out some of the competition that can exist in Canada.
Is that what you're advocating for at CFIB, to have more options available for small businesses?
Always. I mean, we are a free market focused organization, and the greater the competition, the more options that there are, the better off I think small businesses and Canadians are overall. So hopefully, we'll see some interesting startups coming in the next couple of years as we see open banking coming to Canada.
Open banking, just to describe that in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, it essentially allows third parties to come in and work with clients to sort of provide information where you can better compare what each bank is going to offer you without having to like take your information from one bank and then bring it to another, which can be a really onerous thing to do. This is going to allow folks to actually compare banks more easily because basically the banks will have to provide your information to other establishments, whether it's other banks or other fintechs, and therefore you can shop around a lot more easily. It'll also provide more services to small businesses to help them manage their finances. So I think that there could be some interesting opportunities in the coming years. We'll have to see what happens.
That's interesting. Like, we're seeing the start of that with, Wealth Simple and some of these other investment apps that make it easier for people to do these investments without all of the architecture. So this seems to be, is this being driven by blockchain and some of the other trends online?
I think it's certainly that. It's also governments sort of opening up some of the rules and putting some more rules around how businesses can operate within this sort of new environment. It's already something that's in place in the UK, for example, and so we have some examples to watch to see how it's been working there. But it is a fairly new concept that's starting to, I think, broaden out people's opportunities because of the online environments to potentially find new solutions to help them with their financing when it comes to small business lending, for example.
And has COVID kind of impacted? You mentioned one aspect of it, which is the online transactions. It seems that this is just another manifestation of how COVID has had these unintended impacts, right?
Absolutely. There was a massive transition to digital payments over COVID. Not just the credit cards benefited, Interac e-transfers went like skyrocketing. A lot of businesses were using Interac e-transfers to take payments. When you think about that little corner market, or farmers market on the weekends who used to always take cash, many of them converted to things like Interac e-transfer. So yeah, it was a massive transition, and my sense is not much of that is going to go back to the way it was. We're going to continue to see that transition. It may go back a little bit because some people will prefer still using cash, but I think for the most part, we've seen a real shift more towards digital payments, whether it's credit card or e-transfers of any type.
I would tend to agree with you. I think that we've crossed Rubicon there, and the era of just cash is kind of over. So very interesting to watch. We'll be back with our guest after this break. Please stay with us. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here with Corinne Pohlmann. She is a Senior VP, National Affairs and Partnerships at the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Corinne, I'm going to broaden this out again a little bit even more, since we've got you on the program, why not? I'd love to know what other ways you are advocating for small business these days.
Well, of course, we're coming out of COVID, and that is still having a significant impact on a lot of small businesses. Our latest data show that 58% of businesses are still not back to normal revenues or pre-pandemic revenues. It's still a struggle for a lot of small businesses trying to understand how to bring back customers. That has a lot to do with things like the shortage of labor, which is a huge issue, finding the people to actually fill the positions that you have. And if you don't have the people, you may not be able to operate your business as fully as you did pre-pandemic. So that is sort of limiting many of them. Secondly, many of them are they have accumulated quite a bit of debt due to the pandemic. We've estimated it's in the vicinity of 140 to 150,000 on average per small businesses. This is COVID-related debt, and they're struggling to pay that off. About half of them are still haven't paid any of it. So there is some issues there that we still have to, I think, deal with as an economy, and that's a big focus for us with the government. Is how do we make sure we're not increasing the cost of doing business? Because as with everybody else, inflation is hitting small businesses too. And when you have that debt load and you can't get the people to get your revenues back up, it's sort of it's a hit after hit after hit. So a lot of our focus right now is how do we make sure we reduce the cost of doing business? And one way, of course, is to make sure we don't continue to increase taxes, which unfortunately is on the agenda in the coming months with at the federal level, at least.
Are you expecting something in the next budget that's going to hit small businesses hard?
Well, we know, for example, that CPP will be going up
Right.
come January, and it's going to be another significant increase. This has been going up now for about 5 years. Employment insurance premiums, which were frozen for the last 2 years, are expected to go up as well on January 1st. Carbon taxes, we know, are going up significantly over the course of the next few years. So there's a lot of taxes that are increases that are already in place that we know are still coming, and those costs can be significant for small companies.
What else then are you calling on government to do more of or to do less of? Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, certainly, like I said, it is looking at the taxation system. We also think it's an opportunity to still look at ways that we can deal with that debt. Many of the COVID assistance programs ended in May. Well, in fact, they all did. But we also, because the debt is still there, are the ways that we can help the hardest hit from basically help them with that debt. So increase the forgivable portion of something called the Canada Emergency Business Account Loan, which they have to start paying back now. They have until the end of 23 to pay it back to still get the forgivable portion, which is good. But we're certainly looking at other measures as well to continue to encourage investment into the economy and so forth. But I think for now, it's really about how do I deal with high costs and how do I find the people I need to run my business?
Yeah, it still seems, I don't want to make it be overly dramatic, but it still seems that a lot of these small businesses are living paycheck to paycheck or hand to mouth, whatever you want to use. It's still, despite COVID being for all intents and purposes over in terms of driving lockdowns and other government responses, this after effect is still tangible, isn't it?
It is. As I said, 58% are still not at pre-pandemic revenues. We know that about 1 in 6, 1 in 7 are actively considering closing their business because the debt load is just too high and they can't manage through it. So yeah, I mean, and there are certain sectors that were really hit hard, and we need to sort of acknowledge that. And I think while we like to think that this was a summer where everybody came back, if you're in an industry that was shut down for most of 2 years, one summer isn't going to be enough to get you back to where you were.
Do you find it? We've got about 20 seconds left. So optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
Always optimistic. Yeah, always optimistic. The one thing about small business owners and entrepreneurs is I don't think you can become one unless you are optimistic and willing to take those risks. So I think they will persevere and we will have many great small businesses going forward.
Well, on that note, Corinne Pohlmann, thank you for joining us today. Very informative all around. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Interesting discussion with Corinne Pohlmann of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Obviously, our small businesses are still struggling post-COVID. This up to $5,000 rebate will help with the cost of their processing fees, but still, it's quite onerous to deal with the credit card transactions for these small businesses. So lots of information there. Hope you found it informative. Thanks for watching today.